I'm Jamie Jackson, spokesman for the Master's Seminary, and have the great privilege of being joined once again by Dr. Nate Busenitz. So we talked a while ago about blood moons. Let's talk about full moons and Halloween. Should Christians and can Christians celebrate Halloween?
Yeah, with Halloween right around the corner, that's a question that a lot of Christians are thinking about this time of year. And some would go back and look at the history of where Halloween comes from, and they would note that there are some pagan influences in some of the traditions that have become associated with Halloween. But I think in American culture, Halloween has really become more of a secular holiday. It doesn't really have those religious overtones anymore. In terms of how Christians think about how and even if they should participate in Halloween, I think there's a couple principles that they need to keep in mind. First and foremost, they need to avoid anything that smacks of that which would be demonic or immodest, anything that smacks of debauchery or sexual perversion, immorality. These are things that Christians need to avoid. And there are some in our culture who try and use Halloween as an opportunity to celebrate those deeds of darkness. I think that's what Paul is talking about, at least in part, in places like Ephesians 5. And Christians need to avoid the sinful deeds of darkness. Our job is to actually confront those things and avoid those things in our culture in order to be those who are living in a way that honors and pleases Christ.
Let's look at the other side of the spectrum, because is it fair to say that this is also maybe a Christian liberty issue as well? I mean, what about those who feel maybe convicted about celebrating it?
Well, that actually brings me to the second principle. So the first principle, anything that is overtly sinful, anything that is sinful, needs to be avoided by Christians. But there are activities associated with Halloween that are not necessarily inherently sinful. For a little child to put on an innocent costume and meet their neighbors and get some candy, the Bible doesn't specifically prohibit that kind of behavior. So it does raise a question of Christian liberty. And when we think about Christian liberty, two of the main passages that we might go to would be Romans 14 and 15 and 1 Corinthians 8 and 9, where the Apostle Paul talks about Christians eating food that was offered to idols. It's not a direct parallel to Halloween, but certainly the principles that are in those chapters would apply to something like this. And I think there's maybe three basic principles there, maybe more, but three that I want to mention that are very important. And I'll phrase them in the form of questions. Number one, is this activity something that dishonors Christ? That's a question that Christians need to ask. 1 Corinthians 10:31, whether you eat or drink, whatever you do, do all for the glory of God. So can I glorify God in doing this activity? That's the positive way of stating it. Or on the negative side, does this activity actually dishonor the Lord in some way? If it does, then Christians ought to avoid it. Then a second principle or a second question is this activity something that violates my conscience? And Paul brings that principle out, especially in 1 Corinthians 8 and 9, that it is a sin to violate your conscience. So Christians should not participate in anything that violates their conscience. And then a third principle, a third question is this an activity that might cause a weaker brother to stumble? In other words, another Christian who has a more sensitive conscience than I do, if they see me doing this and then they do it themselves, will they be led into sin because they'll actually be violating their conscience? So we want to be very sensitive to the consciences of others, and that's part of looking out for one another in the body of Christ. So these are the basic principles that would apply to how Christians ought to think about liberty issues, and I think Halloween would be one that would fit under that category.